at the end of the session. Then I'm going to welcome Max, who will cover other management practices and mixed varieties, variety mixing.
So thank you, Johan, and the rest of the organization for inviting me to talk about this thing that is probably quite new to most of you guys, which is intercropping, mixed cropping, variety mixtures, and what kind of genetic effects are present in these systems. So my name is Max. I'm a researcher at plant breeding here at the university, and I've been working on this stuff for the past year. And I'm going to give you guys like some kind of tutorial about how you can think about these things to keep it a little easy to digest. So I actually wanted to start with a joke to get my nerves down a little bit, but I couldn't think of one, so I think we just better get started. So this is not a joke. I think some of you might recognize this picture, but it illustrates that the Earth is in quite a poor state nowadays. Most of its boundaries have been crossed. And in this abstract of this study, they concluded that the Earth is well outside of its safe operating space for humanity. So if you do nothing, then all your work may be for nothing, unfortunately. And also relevant for us, agriculture is actually one of the major drivers in this crossing of these boundaries. And this system needs to be radically transformed to overcome this. And yesterday morning, a few speakers touched a little bit on this, that we may need to think a little bit about changing the agricultural system. However, I haven't heard much about it in the rest of the talks. It was more about improving the current system than introducing a new one. So that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about, because these diversified systems could be an opportunity to help with this problem. So first, a little bit of a definition. What is a diversified cropping system? Well, this paper defined it as any type of agricultural diversification practice that involves increasing the diversity of cultivated annual or perennial crops, and it can include non-harvested crops like cover crops, and it can be both at the genetic or at the species level. So we are talking about things like agroforestry, which can be food forest, or simply silvopastures, which is combining animals and plants together, or intercropping, combining multiple crops together on the same field, which you can do completely mixed or in strips, or maybe even a more simple form, which is just cultivar mixtures. You can think of many more things. So a little bit about the benefits and why it may help with this issue of the Earth. So some benefits that are observed is that these systems have increased associated biodiversity, which is, biodiversity is going down rapidly, so this is a nice thing. But also pest and disease control, water quality, water regulation, soil quality, all these other things can actually be improved compared to monocultures. Now, I already hear some of you probably thinking, Max, this is all nice and easy, but this is maybe for hippies or whatever. What about our precious yields? We need to feed the world. And that's actually also one of the benefits of these systems, because not always, but on average, they have slightly increased yields and product quality, and in some cases, yield stability, which is, of course, quite important with this climate change thing. And the bottom one is actually also really important, and it's the input use efficiency. So these systems can be better at using the inputs they have compared to monoculture. So maybe it's a way of also reducing the inputs we need. And this paper, this meta-study of meta-studies was mostly talking about species level diversification, but similar benefits can also be seen in variety mixtures. So I hope you can read this, but this is a meta-study that was published this year, and they compared all these different crops and variety mixtures, and in general they saw increases in yield and yield components, only of a few percent. But also on the bottom right, you can see quite a substantial reduction in disease presence and disease progression. And actually, if you start looking at the crops specifically, so these are the most important crops they looked at this paper, it varies quite a bit which crops and how they benefit. For example, rice, you can see on average of the 72 studies they looked at, the yield increases, it's almost 20%. That's really a lot. But also wheat, a few percentage, a few percentage is already a lot. And it's good to keep in mind that these advantages For example, this one also, that the temporal variability and spatial variability also goes down with the number of genotypes you introduce to your field. And all these advantages are actually seen in mostly random selections of cultivars. So most of these studies, they just have a set of varieties, they mix them together and they see what happens. There's little thought behind what genotype should I put together, why should I put them together, and even then they see this increases. So you can only imagine when plant breeding got started and we try to understand what makes varieties good partners to each other, how much more increases we can get. So in our own studies, we also see these observations. Last year we did a trial with quinoa, which is a pseudo cereal. And we saw these similar effects where the number of varieties in the mixture actually increased the yield and lowered within trial variability. This was only one trial, it was a pilot. This is another thing we did this year, which was faba bean and maize strip cropping. And we could see in the case of faba bean, actually all the varieties we tested increased in yield. This is in percentage, and the color represents the absolute values in tons per hectare. But another interesting thing we saw, so a big storm moved over our field, which caused quite a bit of lodging, which normally you would think of, this is bad for my trial, you know. But what we saw is that in the strips, the lodging was actually reduced a lot. So there's something with maybe the maize, it was a little bit short at that time, so maybe the wind could pass through the strips, and it wasn't hitting the faba beans as much as it was in the monoculture. So how do we breed for this system? So yeah, this is the publication that made this nice flow chart of how to breed for it. I would have liked to go into it really in depth. I only have 15 minutes, so we can zoom in a little bit. And that's how we assess the variation in these systems. So do component species show variation for performance in intercropping? And you can replace intercropping also by variety mixtures or something else. But how do we measure that? What's performance? Is it only yield, or should we look at some other things? Well, we can model it mostly in two ways, and it depends whether you can separate the harvested product or not. So you can imagine in strip cropping, it's quite easy to harvest the maize on its own and the faba bean on its own. But if you completely mix it together, that becomes a little bit harder. So you need different models because you cannot separate the yield components. So today I'm going to talk about the case where you can separate them. But if you are interested in the cannot separate, so that's also variety mixtures, I suggest this paper. So the direct and indirect genetic effects. So that's the main thing. So this is in a normal monoculture situation. You have your barley plant, and the only genetic component that's influencing the barley plant is the barley genome, its own genes. But let's say you introduce P into the picture. Well, of course, the P genotype genetics influences the P phenotype, but we also get this crossing where you see that the genotype of the barley plant can actually influence the phenotype of the pea plant. So that can be, for example, the barley is really strong genetically, it has a strong stem, which allows the pea to climb into it and capture more sunlight. So maybe the pea yield is increased because the barley is has a genetically strong stem. And you can think of all kinds of interactions there. So when we look at the yield here, so we have the direct for yield for barley, for example, we have the direct effect of the barley genotype and the indirect genetic effect of the pea genotype, and the other way around as well. So in both component crops, we want to maximize these. So then we want to do our trials, and we want to put our combinations of genotypes on the field, but unfortunately, it's just not feasible to test all possible combinations. As you can see, the amount of combination goes up exponentially with the number of genotypes, both in the case of crop mixtures and cultivar mixtures. So we need to use incomplete factorial designs, and mixed models can help us with that, of course. This paper from my colleague Benedict Haug, he simulated these 4 field designs, and he saw similar accuracies in estimations compared to the complete design and the incomplete factorial design. So he also estimated then these variance components for these indirect and direct genetic effects. Can I have a pointer? Yeah, so no, I have to point this. Okay, so here we have the P yield, for example, and then this green bar is the variance component for barley genotype on P yield. And you can see it's in similar sizes the P genotype itself, and the same goes for barley. So you can see if you want to breed for these systems and you want to breed a high-yielding barley for this system, it's actually also good to think about what kind of P genotype do I put next to it, because it depends a lot in terms of yield. This is another paper where they did Arabidopsis genotype mixtures, and you can also see that there was this small heritability for an indirect genetic effect in terms of biomass. But another important thing they saw is there was a negative covariance between these direct and indirect genetic effects. So there's some kind of trade-off. And when they plotted it against each other, well, this is, I think, quite a clear trend. If you are good in terms of your own performance, you are a bad neighbor. You reduce the performance of your neighbor. It's like a competition effect. And this was also seen in the PM barley example, where you see this clear negative trend. But what's important to realize is that even though this trend is negative, there are still genotypes in there that both have a positive effect on itself and on their neighbor. So there is some room for selection maybe, and even in this really extreme example in Arabidopsis. So then we start thinking about breeding. An important question is, of course, should we select in these diversified systems, or should we select in monoculture and later test them for their suitability? And this depends, of course, on the presence of the G by M, and the M is in this case monoculture versus a diversified system. So traditionally, when you compare environment or management systems, you just look at the yield in those systems and compare them. But in this case, it might be a little bit misleading to just compare the yield in monoculture for the yield in a diverse system like that, because its own yield is not the only thing it's doing. Due to this presence of indirect genetic effects, a really high yielding genotype in, say, strip cropping might actually be not a good performer, because it is really reducing the quality or the yield of its neighbor. So how do we balance this importance? We can use economic weights. So say we know the value of one crop and we know the value of this other crop. We can calculate the selection index like this. And then we can start simulating. So we know all the variance components from an experiment, and we know these values of these crops. In this case, they are equal. So in terms of genetic improvement, they are similar. So the dark line with the box around it is the selection index, and then the circles is the direct effect. And because of this negative interaction, you see we mostly select for direct effect, and the indirect genetic effect is left behind. But if one crop is more valuable than the other, we see opposite trends. So in the valuable crop, we mostly select for its own performance. How good is the genotype for its own performance? But for barley in this case, which is half the value of P, this is something I don't know if it's really the case, but it's an illustration. You can see in barley, we actually find the indirect genetic effect to be more important. That one is increasing more, while the direct effect more or less stays level over the period. So what's next for this kind of research? Well, we really need to assess the direct and indirect genetic effect variance and covariance across more crops. It's quite lacking currently, this knowledge. An important thing to consider with that is, are our modern cultivars variable enough for these traits? There is some evidence that these biodiversity effects are reduced in our elite varieties compared to their wild relatives. Also, we need to find some key underlying traits. So what traits are important for indirect genetic effects? This is the B barley example again, where they saw that the early that flowering onset is negatively correlated with the associate effect. So that's the indirect genetic effect, which means the earlier you flower, the better you are as a neighbor. But the interesting thing about this trait is that it didn't have an effect on the producer effect, which is the direct genetic effect. So this could be a trait to decouple this negative covariance where you select for early flowering. It doesn't come at the cost of yield, but it does improve the barley yield. And then to build on that, it's also interesting to know what kind of genes are involved. There's some research been done, as you can see, almost always in Arabidopsis, so that's maybe an improvement where we can look at the actual crops. And also between species, so most of this research has also been on Arabidopsis versus Arabidopsis mixtures, not Arabidopsis with another crop, for example. And then we can also start thinking about designing breeding programs, because doing a trial where you mix all these crops together, it's much more laborious and more expensive than just breeding in monoculture. So when do we switch when do we stop selecting in monoculture, and when do we move over to selecting in mixtures? That's another question. Yeah, and I want to thank all these people for helping me with my research and stuff. Yeah.
I'm really curious to see Arabidopsis next to a maze. Is there one question I'll allow before the discussion here?
Thank you for your presentation. Maybe I missed, but how do you know, from where you get this prior knowledge that, let's say barley and pea in your example, or maize and soybean, they have a positive interaction?
Yeah, well, you could use maybe ecological theory to make a prediction, but mostly it's just trying out stuff. There's this big crop mix program here at the university, which researches crop compatibility and strip cropping, but they mostly do it on the crop level, so they don't really include genotypes in their experiments. So maybe their results, they show these two crops are potential good partners, and then more breeding-focused research could look at the genotype effects. Is that just a general effect, or does it depend on the genotypes you grow?
So there is no clear criteria how you select your crops in the cropping system?
Sorry?
There is no clear criteria how you select your crops in a cropping system?
Yeah, well, it has to do with all kinds of things, management limitations, or just the crops you want to grow.
Another point is, if you look at it in a large scale farming, how it will be easy for farmers if you crop like maize and soybean together at the time of harvest. You have 3 rows of maize and 3 rows of beans, other crops. So
that's actually one of the biggest challenges with these systems, is their practical limitations. You cannot just combine every crop together, because for example, if you completely mix them, they need to be harvested together. And if one is done way earlier than the other, maybe by the time you harvest, your yield for the one crop has been lost. But that's something that, for example, strip cropping tries to solve, where you have these strips that are just wide enough for your machines to separately harvest the crops. Or you can think of variety mixtures where it might not be an issue that in your harvested product you have this genetic diversity. It's a big challenge. I'm not really involved in this. You see in this part of this picture the accelerating change and the flexible processing. These were done by my colleagues. I mostly focused on the design of these experiments and analyzing them. Yeah.
Thank you, Max.
Yeah.